Please scoot into the middle if you can to make room for others.
Oh, right, because there's your introduction.
All right. Good morning. Happy Pride Month. Welcome to New Polity's second conference. They say third time's the charm, so this won't be the good one. Go ahead and buy your tickets for the next one at the door. I'm going to give a few announcements after the talk, my talk anyways. But are we all comfortable? Any big complaints of body or soul? Well, not soul, I don't want to hear that. Body complaints, we're good? Maybe I don't want to hear the body complaints either, now that I think about it. But we can all hear me, that's the important part. I was given the charge by my betters, if not my elders, to introduce this conference. And I thought, what better way to begin than by a certain excess of personal revelation? I know that in our culture, if there's one thing that we miss, crave, and long for, it's for people to express themselves. We don't get enough of that. So I thought, why not fill that void here in Steubenville, Ohio? So I have a confession, and I haven't told anyone, neither my colleagues, certain members of my family know this, but because of certain criminal proceedings having finished, I'm able to say this for the first time, really, in 2 years. I'm very excited to give this story of my life, a sort of untold story that now I get to tell. In my early collegiate days, heady as they were with cheap beer and deep thoughts, I fancied myself as something of a political intellectual. I joined the Young Republican Club. I regularly debated topics such as the future of Social Security and the Social Security of the future. I wore bow ties without irony. I wore pastel shorts in the summer. I still wear pastel shorts in the summer. And perhaps it was because of this quasi-athletic and yet conservative aesthetic, or perhaps it was because of the reputation of my parents, who have both done stints in the CIA, that I was approached in the summer of 2016 by a recruiter from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was an odd fellow, I mean it. He bought me lunch at the Texas Roadhouse, just up the road here. And he said, "This is on the American taxpayer, don't worry." He wanted to discuss an internship opportunity for me. He ordered a steak, well done. And then, as if he were parceling out 40-acre plots to early American colonists, he cut the whole thing in a grid and then proceeded to eat it in alternating columns and rows, column, row, coming down to a corner. I worried about whether I was going to leave the meeting alive. I try to do his accent, but it's hard. I'll do my best. You see, kid, he said, I was like you once. Hungover, I suggested. No, full of ideals. That's right, full of ideals. You see, America, it's the best idea the world has ever had. America. Freedom for all. Prosperity, if you want it. Hell yes, I suggested. That's right, kid. Equality. Rule of law. Separation of powers. A constitution written by God. Was it? I demurred. Oh, that's the beauty of it, kid. You're free to think so or not think so. And no one's going to burn you at the stake for doing either one. Freedom of religion. See, that's America. And we celebrate that. 4th of July. Memorial Day. President's Day. Martin Luther King Day, I suggested. That's right, kid. Pride Month. Tax Day, I said, getting into the spirit of things. That's right, kid. Flag Day. And this went on for some time, wherein the glories of our sovereign nation were extolled by these brief recollections of its principal holidays, an exercise which exhilarated me not only because it is a certain litany of patriotism, but also because it stirred the natural spirit, even the American spirit, so healthy in a commercial republic, of deadly competition, in which I strived with him to say the last holiday, back and forth. I think I won with Prostate Cancer Awareness Week, because at its very mention, the FBI agent's face clouded, and he stared at one of his homesteads of steak as if it had done him some personal prostate injury. Kid, he said, not everyone thinks like you and me think. Would you believe it if I told you that in this very town, God's own Ohio, with its Dairy Queens and its Burger Kings, I said, no, Steubenville doesn't have a Burger King. Their algorithm, it deemed it not profitable, actually. He said, would you believe me that an anti-government movement is well on its way? He proceeded to inform me that the FBI had received a charter in recent years to enlarge that letter I of its acronym in response to the growing threat of what he called alternatively fascists, anti-government agitators, crypto-communist Catholics, and something he called integralists. I don't know. I asked him about that latter thing. He said, oh, don't worry, it doesn't mean anything. It's an online thing. My guy Jeff, he invented it to organize the theocrats. It was the biggest IP address steal we ever got. Listen, kid, he said, we need your help. The American dream, the thing that has every poor kid from every poor country in the world wishing he were here rather than there, it's being choked by domestic terrorists. He laid out my internship opportunity. I was to infiltrate the anarcho-theocratic, esoterically communistic, fascist, Catholic, agrarian, anti-American movement, also called localism by some people, to begin a regular conference attracting such intellectual ideologues. I was to gather their information and report regularly to the Bureau. It all sounded terribly exciting, and even more so when he laid out the compensation plan. After a week of safe environment training, a diversity seminar, some lessons with a handgun, I was given a wire, a supervisor, and a commission. Now, the Bush era still resonated strong with these types. I'm sure you've met them. So I was also given a pack of playing cards on which the principal players milling about this post-industrial surrounding were printed, hierarchically, of course. So with some fear, I approached who was technically the king of hearts, Andrew Willard Jones. And this began some of my difficulties. With the Bureau, that is. Now, everyone with a child knows what it's like to be tempted away from some basic application of the law by upsetting an undue reflection as to the principles behind that law. So what I mean is, but Dad, you did allow me to pee outside. You allowed me when it was going to Grammy's house. You said that peeing outside is one of the lesser glories of masculinity, and so why can't I do it now, and so on. Now, the point that I'm trying to make here is that the purpose of the Bureau and associated agencies is to simply ignore such questions of principle and to enforce the law and defend the Constitution. As my supervisor made it abundantly clear, we are not to be waylaid or tempted, but to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But recall my bow ties. Recall my shorts. Recall the debate clubs, the young Republican clubs. I posted often. I was not immune to these intellectual discussions. Now, in preparation for some of the legal cases that later happened against me, I was going through recordings between my supervisor and I, which express my state of confusion after speaking with Andrew. I won't attempt an impression of my supervisor as I did with my recruiter, who, by the luck of a random codename generator I called Mr. Serpent, or Serpy Serp, as the mood demanded. He had an air of one always playing Minesweeper or investing in the stock market precisely at the moment he's speaking to you. So I'll try it once and then I'll give it up. So do they, what do they think? America is it's a tyranny or what? What is it? They do, I said. So how are we rating the threat here, said my supervisor. Are they making memes? No, not many memes. Well, that's good, that's good. Any fertilizer purchases? Have they narrowed in on a political target? Well, it's difficult. See, they think tyranny is rule for private gain. And that tyranny describes a relation between the ruler and the ruled. And this makes it difficult because it means there's never one person, right? The very existence of a tyrant on one level means that there's a tyrant on a lower level. All tyrants are enabled by lesser tyrants. So both the ruled and the ruler within a tyranny are seeking their own self-interest. This is what makes tyranny possible. They're seeking their own self-interest as opposed to something that these fascists call the common good. What's that? He asked. Something Marxist? No, Catholic, oddly, I said. It describes the good common to all, ultimately God himself. The line between tyranny and just rule, not tyranny, is simply whether power is wielded for oneself or for the sake of others. Oh, I see, they're hippies, he said. Oh, yeah, no, they're a lot like hippies, actually, yeah. They tend to think corporations much more as tyrannical forms than they do any politicians, but they also have a lot of guns. I don't know. Well, who's their target? I say it's tough to say. Again, see, tyranny is a vice for them. It's an affliction of the soul. It's operative wherever anyone with power over another uses it for themselves rather than for that other, rather than for lifting the other up, empowering him, so that he has virtue, property of his own. And this can happen as equally between a father and a son as between a congressman and his constituents. There was a character, he was under the Jack of Spades here, but he told me in one of our conversations that I recorded that technically you can be a tyrant over a turnip. These guys sound harmless, said my supervisor. Well, I said, he said, I mean it, they're harmless. They're too busy to do something like kidnap a senator, Hey, by the way, do you think any of them could kidnap a senator for me? I said, well, I don't know. They don't seem like the type. He says, okay, don't worry, I'll drop it. I mean, I said to him, he says to me, sorry, they seem to like equality. I mean, how could you really be worried about people that like equality? I said, no, they hate equality. They really hate it. Because they think that these differing power relations, right, the fact of having power over another, whether it's the father to the son, or simply the stronger to the weaker, or the louder, the person with a microphone to the person who does not have a microphone, that these relationships of difference are precisely what make love possible. They're the precondition for virtue, because only with indifference do you have a gift to offer to the other, right? Only in the relative lack of the other is he able to receive. And without those differences, the sort of homogeneous flavor of a modern democracy, you simply have less and less love, approaching a 0 point of an entirely loveless world. I mean, they want to flip that on its head, increase differences, and have them all, each member of a difference related to an increase in love, an increase in communion, ultimately unto the beatific vision. So he said they definitely wouldn't kidnap the senator. I said, probably not. He said, rats. I said, why? What's going on up there? He said, nothing. Okay, your guys, the Catholics. So what you're telling me is these Catholics, they think they're the tyrants, right? So they're mad at themselves. I said, yeah, sort of. They think every sin is an act whereby the soul, which properly lives for God and for neighbor, turns in on itself and actually invents for the first time in the cosmos what we call the private domain, whose life and pleasure it seeks to secure over and against those others who actually provide for it, namely God and neighbor, who maintain it in being. But it's not like they think that this tyranny is just some secret interior thing, Mr. Serpent. They think that their own tyranny and the tyranny of others is the necessary condition and subsequent effect of tyranny at higher levels of power, of the big bad guys that we're worried about, of the fascists. See, Mr. Serpent? Only a people who are fundamentally fearful, seeking to secure themselves apart from the infinite securing gift of God, could possibly be motivated by a tyrant. Because a tyrant rules for private gain, remember? He said. And so by definition, no one wants to obey a tyrant. I mean, he's not ruling for them, right? He's ruling for private gain. And so if a tyrant wants to get them to do what he wants, he can't just show up and start telling everyone to do this or that so that he can be richer or appear more divine, or so that he can afford to buy an Xbox, say. No, he has to rely on other people who are fearfully seeking their own private gain and who see his rule not as leading them closer to any goods that they desire by nature, but as either a hindrance or an obstacle to their attainment of their own private gains, right? He has to appear as providing to the little tyrants precisely what the big tyrant wants, either hindering them or helping them. At this point, my supervisor reminded me to file my 1099. I don't know why it reminded him of that. I said, yeah, I did. So my point is, it takes tyrants to make a tyrant, Mr. Serpent. That's what I'm saying. That's what you're saying? I mean, that's what they're saying. I clarified. You need to watch yourself, buddy, he said. You can see as I go through this transcript the kind of conversion of my own feelings. It was difficult for me. I said, sorry, supervisor, but you see the logic. I mean, cultural and moral corruption at lower levels are simply the necessary condition for tyranny at higher levels. A virtuous people would either laugh at a tyrant or kill him on the spot because they would be, by virtue, pursuing the common good and so unable to stomach any appearance of rule for the sake of private gain. But this is just all religious belief, my supervisor said, right? I mean, nothing you've said makes me think they're going to do anything. What are they going to have, a philosophy conference? I mean, they don't want to take power. They do, actually. They really do. But wouldn't that be sinful for them to take power? Well, no, not if power is wielded for the sake of others. Oh, right, he said. I forgot that. I mean, the Andrew guy, right? He has this mantra. It's obnoxious, really. He never stops. But he always says that virtue is a greater source of power than vice, that it actually increases a man's capacity for action. Or woman's, said my supervisor. That's right, or woman's capacity for action. Power increases in a just ruler from, and when we say just ruler, of course, we mean anyone with more power than another in a relative situation. It increases, virtue increases power within a just ruler, capacity for action within a just ruler, and it decreases to the point of vanishing that same power, that same capacity for action in a tyrant. Can I read you something one of these guys wrote, I asked. He said. And so I brought it here. Here's what was written by this one guy. The tyrant is unable to call upon the power of trust and obedience. That is to say that the tyrant is always tyrannized. Tyrannosaurus rex is not so rexy, because his rule is motivated by an object which de facto cannot be the same object of the one he rules, namely his own private gain. He can never, as tyrant, say, do this and be obeyed. This may seem silly. What then do we make of all this general falling in line, the goose stepping, the men who consent to step like geese? Are they not obeying the tyrant, honking when he says honk, hissing when a good hiss fits his mood? No, conformity and consent are not quite obedience. The word may serve in a loose sense, but we of the Neapolitan-flavored school of thought, with all our communio and nouvelle theologie influences, while we'll never be accused of rigorous and painstaking word choice, still, even we have our limits. Obedience is a virtue, not a reflex. It's a habit tending us towards the fullness of our powers, not a cringing or a shrinking whereby we castrate them. To obey a ruler is not merely to submit, but to trust that he orders you, not ordering you about, but orders you within, that he orders you towards the common good, which is your good. For there is no common good without the commoner, of whom you are the first. But why speak in riddles? All we mean is right rule calls upon the trust that the ruled has, that the one who is ruled has. That the ruler is, as St. Paul says, a servant for your good. We serve in obedience our rulers. We serve our rulers in obedience to them precisely insofar as they appear to be ruling for our good, which is most intensely the common good. This loving relationship between ruler and the ruled is so intimate, so full of magic and possibility that Aquinas could ascribe it without hesitation to the marriage relationship between Adam and Eve, ruler and ruled. Now, a tyrant does not know what it is to be obeyed, because he rules not for the good of others, but for himself, and so he cannot motivate others unreservedly, as the just ruler can. He cannot say, "My son, you know I am a servant for the sake of your glory, power, and peace. Therefore, obey me when I say, take up arms and invade the U.S. Capitol." He can only say, as it were, "You know I only serve myself. Still, you may be able to serve yourself as well by doing what I say. Serving my interest is in your best interest, and if it isn't, I will manipulate the world to make it so. That is to say, I'll pay you to invade the Capitol, and I will flog you if you don't." The tyrant utilizes punishments and rewards to create a simulation of just rule. For if the ruler has one's good as his own lovely goal and the prime motivation of his rule, then disobedience to that ruler simply is punishment, first and foremost. And obedience simply is reward. That is to say, the loss or gain of the good that is due to me. Where the good of the other is not the goal, one must construct a new world in which loss or gain can be delivered extrinsically. Money is a good technique for doing this. With it, you can lock people into styrofoam boxes, you can flicker LED lights at them, you can make them mine Bitcoin and wear shirts that say things like, "I love my job," things abhorrent to nature, obstacles to human flourishing, crippling of the body, sterilizing of human fecundity. You can do all of this to them for the sake of your own private gain, insofar as you arrange the world in such a manner that their submission to you accrues to their private gain. I'm talking, of course, about a wage. But creating an alternative world of rewards and punishments to fake the appearance of just rule is no easy task, my friend. The tyrant always becomes a slave to whatever technology he puts in place in order to not rule for the sake of others, and instead to rule for himself, and yet not be killed. Thus, to take an example, our Wall Street class, tyrants obviously, nakedly admit that they hold power for the sake of private gain, and they work harder and longer and more miserably, somebody told me a 70-hour work week, than those whom their tyranny manipulates. It takes a lot of work to not work. Our governing tyrants put in more hours, travel more, and require more Botox than those over whom they would lord their authority. The idle tyrant, the big fat idle tyrant, is an idle dream, a big fat idle dream. The anxious, fearful tyrant is the reality. Bless him, pray for him, for he is holding the weight of an alternative cosmos in which certain acts must be artificially rewarded and others artificially punished, and no God will help him in his task, for he has taken up the seat of God, of course. This is, by the way, says this thinker, why the whole QAnon theory has a certain aesthetic sense to it, whatever is true or false about it. Because debauchery does not belong to tyrants because they are idle. It belongs to tyrants because they are busy, busy bees. And a busy, tyrannical bee faces a daily conundrum, namely that he rules for private gain, which surely includes various pleasures of the flesh. But because no one trusts him or obeys him apart from his own extrinsic mechanism, then he spends his whole day buzzing about, hiring, firing, giving, taking, meeting with the secret police to discuss Dave, now Dennis, and after all, is Dennis really resisting the regime or is he just slow, that sort of thing. That whatever time can be actually devoted to the enjoyment of private gain shrinks, and tempts the tyrant to accentuate by perversion those pleasures which are denied to him by the necessities of his rule for private gain. He has to do a lot more in a lot less time. This is a working theory of mine, of this guy's. Just rule is not like this at all. For rather than building a world in which actions which accrue to the gain of the ruler, rather than building a world in which, we're just going to move on. Just rule is subordinated to the nature of things, as to God. One need only love others and help them in virtue. That sometimes people may need to be coerced is obvious, but it is only the remedial side of rule. Whoever sins in the work of the flesh hinder obedience. Wherever the mutual and asymmetrical love of the ruler and the ruled fails in its perfect operation. Normally understood, obedience is the fruit of love, and I think we all know this. That when we love someone and we trust them, then we want to obey them because we know that they have our good in mind. So what gradually became clear to me after reading this to my supervisor was that just rule opens up a universe of cultural possibilities, miracles even, that the presence of tyranny in the souls of the ruled and the ruler squashes. The thing was driven home to me when I, at the advice of my supervisor, had a child. You see, I was already 2 weeks married and without child, a fact that was beginning to raise suspicions within the Steubenville community, who reproduce at a rate of 1.4 children per couple per year. To assimilate, he said, you must procreate. Anything for the Bureau, I responded. Took the rest of the day off. The child was born, beautiful, healthy, though with the disturbing habit of providing certain supports for the white nationalist, fascist, anti-government talking points to which I was growing accustomed. Namely, the child appeared to exist in relationship to me, in which his implicit existential trust actually awakened in me a desire to rule, a certain courage to rule, quite apart from any sanction of a sovereign nation state, but rather as a response of love to a show of trust. For far from any experience of cult leadership, fatherhood made me keenly aware that this courage to rule actually came first from the child. I, after all, was not looking to exercise any authority beyond what had been meted out to me by the Bureau. Still, I was filled with the sense that my relatively greater power was naturally for this adorable creature. I set about ordering the child with no thought to his rights or his constitutionally protected status. I ordered him into certain kinds of being. I gave him a language. I tended him towards a perfection that was really his own, I thought, but of which he knew nothing and I apparently had profound authority over. I judged him innocent and guilty of the very same crimes I arrested him for. My God, I said, looking into the mirror, I am becoming a fascist. Still, I said, what can one do? For surely fascists come from somewhere, I suppose. When my supervisor asked me things like, hey, how's the kid? I blushed. I'd say, he's fine, he's free, he's American. Look, he's great. I got to go get him baptized. What really struck me is that within this newfound relationship of trust and authority between me and the kiddo, genuine powers were made available to me that previously were not. Authority and its use in love increased power between us. So for instance, as one example, if my son hurt himself, I could actually make him better. I was able to make him better by kissing him. Now, on one level, I understand that this is like something like a medical lie, but I didn't do it to deceive him. I did it immediately, naturally, without a further thought. He merely presented his wounds. I kissed them. I said, all better, and he was. That's what was amazing. Sure, there might have been a brief account of the injury, but then he would skip off, beaming where he had once been screaming bloody murder. To call this the placebo effect simply gives a name to the phenomenon. It doesn't explain it. It names the way in which a certain level of trust on the side of the ruled meets with a certain use of authority on the side of the ruler and produces the capacity for the healing of souls and bodies. To account for the placebo effect within medical trials is obviously simply accounting for the efficacy of trust and authority within the medical community vis-a-vis their patients. So people trust doctors to heal, doctors give them medicine and authority, and healing occurs accordingly, regardless of the mechanism of action of the pill. There is no need to study whether the same placebo effect would occur if sugar pills were given out by, say, used car salesmen or integralists. It wouldn't work. So I spoke of this to my colleague, who was working in a different field. And he told me, look, man, kids are just stupid. Kids are stupid. He's all better because he's stupid. He's not all better. He's just stupid. Look, Mark, he says, I can take two adult people, and I can tell them just by striking the right tone, just by giving 1 ounce of appearance that I have the truth, or a meaning or a mission. You know what I can make them do? I can make them take a potato and carve spuds for Trump and rocket that thing through the window of the Capitol. I said, the Capitol? He said, don't worry about it. Listen, that's what I'm saying is... What I'm saying is if I can do that with adults, and get them 2, maybe 3 years in prison, easy peasy. I mean, you think about what you can do for kids. People, they're stupid. Maybe, I said. It doesn't seem like it. It seems a little too natural for me. It's not, what'd you call it? He says, it's not, I called it the healing power of authority. Andrew had showed me that the presumption of just rule, that is to say that all rule serves others and loves peace above all, that this was but a norm for Christendom. Not to say an attained norm, but it was the expectation of rule as it came from the Bible. And that, as a result, it was no surprise that the very same Christian kingdoms that called authorities things like the care of souls also ascribed healing power to their kings and popes. The king's touch healed to such an obvious and repeatable extent that the medieval kingdoms of France and England institutionalized these healings. Kings were obliged to go on tours all around the country and just touch people. Touch, touch, touch. Heal, heal, heal. It got a little weird during the time of absolutism, but what didn't? Disenchantment was a bit of a buzzword with these anti-state thugs that I was becoming more and more familiar with. But re-enchantment for them often seems nothing more than the defeat of tyranny. That is to say, the conversion of rule for private gain into rule for others. We look to rulers that can heal, one of them said. This is a sign that the city of God has gained the upper hand against the city of man. I wasn't becoming convinced so much as bewildered, which often is the same thing. I put in my resignation with the Bureau 2 years ago. I settled into the town, replacing my entrapment informant position with a regular position on the editorial board of the Movement's Journal. Now, as a habit, I just kept assimilating. I had more kids, I got rid of my smartphone, I divested from the stock market, purchased land, chickens, I started composting, collecting rainwater, these sorts of things. I started going to church, and have found that this habitual exercise of what was described to me as anarcho-crypto-communistic theocratic fascism is sufficient to inculcate a basic friendliness towards other creatures doing the same thing. It's something of a community now, this whole Steubenville. Friends mutually resisting the temptation to exercise their diverse powers for the sake of private gain and encouraging each other by words and spiritual songs, by praise and encouragement to serve the common good, that mysterious object of love that somehow includes them and yet transcends them, pulling them on through sorrows and joys into an ever-expanding peace. Is America a tyranny? Not always here. Is America a tyranny? Only if we want it. That's what people say around here. I wrote a final report to my supervisor who, exhausted with my various theoretical excursuses, demanded I write a basic threat level evaluation, which is ultimately what the Bureau is after, before ending my internship. So I'll leave it with you. It's my offering to you. And to any FBI informants who've joined us, I'm sure you're there. I figured since you're here, obviously reporting on the domestic terrorist problem, this might be something you could copy down real quick, because then you would have the freedom to listen to the rest of the conference and just enjoy it. And you can have this verbatim. So as far as the Catholic radicals go, by character, they're odd and usually too busy with children to get much done. But in terms of rebellion, they view themselves as the church has always viewed itself in relation to the empires of this world. They believe that they have the moral obligation to suffer and die under tyrants for precisely so long as they do not have the actual power, property, and influence necessary to defend the weak against the aggressions of the selfsame tyranny. They believe, again, in the same breath, that by their suffering and death, they build up the requisite power for the overthrow of that tyranny. They give witness by their blood to an alternative source of political order, and one based on love, the community which adheres together through love rather than through the fear of any sovereign violence, rather than fear of punishments or the loss of the tyrant's reward. So do not fear them for now, but persecute them at the risk of proving their point. Thank you.